Thank you so much for organizing this. There's a lot more for me to thank this center, not just because he introduced me and really humbled with this introduction, but also the fact that the very genesis of this book actually began with a lot of contribution from this place that I'm sitting here. In fact, my love with Monterey began courtesy Bill, because I came as a serving director for the first time in year 2000, courtesy CNS, and I stayed here. That used to be Doubletree, now Portala Plaza. And I came as a guest speaker. Those remarks were off the record because I was still serving and it was not clear to be published. But that was my first ever journey to speak outside the position that I was in, given the fact that it's a sensitive program in every country. And unbeknownst to me that I will be here. But more importantly, there is another contribution of this place that where when I came for the series of fellowship that you mentioned in my introduction, that first publication was done here in Non-Proliferation Review, and it was called Challenges to Nuclear Stability in South Asia, that was published in 2003. I still assign my students that essay because many questions I raised about South Asia 5 years after they conducted the test continues to be relevant even today. Jeff, I think you were the editor.
Not anymore then. It was probably Scott Parrish.
Yeah, but it was. I thought it was a seminal essay because it went through some tremendous amount of review from people who were here as well as in Stanford, and that actually gave the foundation from which took birth a lot of ideas. That very year, 2003, was a very important year, as most of you sitting here would know, that it was the unraveling of the A.Q. Khan's network by the end of that year. And that was what triggered, at the first place, to write a comprehensive account, because then everybody loved to write on A.Q. Khan, and it was coming from bits and pieces from all over the places. And Peter Levoy and I thought that this is the best time to really write a comprehensive story. We went to Pakistan, talked to the president of Pakistan and my former boss, General Kidwai. You got to tell your story out to the world, otherwise, this is going to become, a run amok proliferation sort of a thing, and you would not know what to do. And they agreed. They said, okay, if you're prepared to write, let's play the game. And it took that amount of time, 1 year, for them to really study and approve what are you guys going to do with this book? I mean, what are you going to say? Because usually officials and states and governments do not allow access on nuclear programs. I mean, you try it any country, everybody is smiling and he knows what I'm saying about. But for my person, being from half insider and then trying to write a book, in collaboration with somebody else, obviously the state of Pakistan had tremendous amount of interest to let the story out as to how they thought. So they provided me unprecedented access to interview people, but they would not allow me to interview serving people, allowing me to interview only retired people. And if there was questions that was too sensitive to be answered, they would give what was called background briefing. It was sensitive, so they could firewall the sensitive nature of what was going on. But this book and the research was done under tremendous pressure of the A.Q. Khan network, which in 2004, 5, and 6 was profoundly different because the Pakistani program is only viewed by one lens, and it continues to be viewed with one lens in my assessment even now. There are other lenses that are added now, and that used to be A.Q. Khan Proliferation Network. The second lens that changed was nuclear terrorism. I mean, what would happen if the weapon would go wrong? And the third lens that people watch is that this is most likely to be used, nuclear weapons. So used people, proliferation people, nuclear terrorism people, all three are the people, they look differently. When you put all the three lenses together, it's a pretty blurred picture. It's a pretty scary picture if you start putting all three together. So I thought that there's another part of the story as to how do we put across to the public. And I looked at this title, Eating Grass, and this is a famous quote which I'm sure you all know by now, that if somebody would say that, we will eat grass or leaves or go hungry if India builds a bomb, and we will do that if we have to do that. So we have no other choice. That's what it says. Oh, well, that put me the question to really frame into a theme, what is it about the bomb that you're prepared to go to that extent? And that's the theme of the book continues to be, when it became challenging for me because, so who is the audience? And Jeffrey Byrne comes and says, we're writing this book, he's publishing, he says, who is the audience? And I said, everybody. And Jeffrey remembers this discussion between him and I, and he said, everybody means what? I said, policymakers, academic, who are you addressing? I said, everybody means that the book has to be written in a manner that somebody gets everything out of it. And obviously, it is coming under the security studies genre, so I have to bring the IR theory, I have to bring some justification, some themes in it. So I pick up almost 4 or 5 threads, like the weaver in the southern Sindh province of Pakistan, who picks up 5 threads and really weaves a carpet out there. And that becomes far more challenging than I thought that I would. So one thread was to bring domestic politics and the cultural idiosyncrasies of personalities so that it gives a flavor as to how decisions are made in a country. And I believe every country, people do matter, decision makers do matter, their personalities do matter, their idiosyncrasies matter. So that's one stream that goes along. The second one is about domestic politics and changes, how it was going up and down, in addition that regional crisis. War with India, crisis with India. The third was the ups and downs, the flux of geopolitics. And you'll see that how the flux of geopolitics was playing or not playing the role when it comes to local decision making in Pakistan, as well as affecting its policy program. The fourth was the technological challenges. If scientists read there, Sig Hacker reads that he's not interested in what's going on in Afghanistan, he's interested how plutonium was made. So I had to really put the technical challenges. And then the fifth one was, what were the barriers of international non-proliferation that was overcome? Because when you put all this thing together, it just reads into a fascinating story, one end from the other, so everybody gets something out of it. So some people get bored. And then I got, because somebody's not interested in how an HEU is made, others are only interested in what happened in Afghanistan, somebody only wanted to know how did EQ Khan manage to do it. So you get something from somewhere in this book as you read through, but it was challenging for me because it would have been not interesting at all if I did not embed it into the broader history of the country. And for me, the model was David Holloway. Abner wrote his book, and then John Lewis says China and the Bomb, Perkovich, India and the Bomb. Everybody had this title, Israel and the Bomb, India and the Bomb, China and the Bomb, not going to be Pakistan and the Bomb. So I wanted to change the title and say it's going to be Eating Grass. So Jeffrey comes and says, look, if this title of the book goes, it's going to be lying somewhere in the bookstores in Atkins Diet or South Beach Diet. Do something about it. So he then put those quotes here at the back, at the back of the book, so that people would know where this is going to lie in the book. So that was the background of this whole book as it about to come about. But then Bill, you have been very kind that I've been running workshops here. I just finished one yesterday, and I was telling when I began the workshop on Friday, some of the people that by Sunday morning you should be fed up of my face, if not on discussing about Pakistan. And I said, if something is not wrong with you, then you will be sitting here again, and many of them are still sitting here. So there's really something wrong with you to listen to all of it again, all over. But that gave me a chance to actually talk to a wider audience at CNS. So really, this is the place I've talked a lot more, nowhere else so far. So thank you very much for inviting me here. I began this book by writing a quote from a gentleman who recently died, Gore Vidal is his name. Said, disinformation campaign has metastasized to a level where myth threatens to overthrow history. And that was the quote that I thought that this disinformation was not just going on because of the factors that I mentioned, but it was also going on in Pakistan because the claimants to the bomb are far more. There are many fathers of this bomb who claim a lot more than they achieved. Common sense, or commonly known, is that EQ Khan is the father of the bomb, but I'm actually challenging that myth that yes, he is. He's probably the most important person without whom the bomb would not have been existing. But then the story of the people and the sacrifices associated with that, and the complexities and the challenges associated, is not told. And what motivated me there, because when I read David Holloway's book, saw how much challenging it was, for the Soviets. You read John Lewis's book, he talks about how, the Nai Rongzing was so much pain to go through. And then the debate within, Abner's book talked about the very intense debate on Israel in the 60s. And more importantly, his book, and he and I have gone together writing a lot of chapters here and there, you would find there is a lot of similarities of the nature of the debate and the challenges within the system that was going on in Israel in the mid-60s. And those were the two camps that evolved. One was the nuclear enthusiast camp, and the other was the nuclear sort of cautionist camp. I'm using these two terms rather than calling optimist and pessimist. That really makes it really bad. Because the enthusiast camp had a very strong rationale as to why would they push the bomb in the mid-60s. But it's a very interesting story at the same time, that which also tells you about other states as to why the state would be reluctant to go, and why would the state suddenly convert really as born again into a complete resolved country altogether again. And that it captures that debate for those who are interested in proliferation as to why do states go nuclear. I couldn't write it, so I brought this, the two camp thing. And it's important that what were the nuclear enthusiasts talking about in the mid-60s. And this is the time when China conducts a test in mid-64, in late 64, and the debate is triggered in India. And the Pakistani reaction to that debate, which is captured in George Perkovich's books. I'm not repeating that, but actually I'm just giving you the sense of what's happening in Pakistan at that time. This is the year 65, they go into war with India, and they get defeated in the process, and everything that Pakistanis were having at the time was started derailing, and it continues to derail even today. So the enthusiasts were the ones that was led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the Pakistani Foreign Office at the time, where this quote is coming. This quote was said in May 1965, that we will eat bombs, we will eat grass and build bombs, So they were saying that India's, reactors has got an unsafeguarded facility, and they are pursuing the weapon capability, particularly after the China test. The window is now open. Before the NPT debates, close it down and shuts it down. Here is a window, go for it now, or it will be never. Then they came to realize that the cost of alliance with the United States that had lasted for about 10 years at that time, in the mid-60s, was outweighing the benefits that they were taking. And that too, particularly this two schools started really gaining traction when US slapped embargoes on both India and Pakistan as a result of 1965 war. So they were saying, what? We can't trust an external ally. And this is also the time when Pakistan-Chinese relationship is also evolving, really cementing at this time by mid-60s. The main argument was that the NPT debate has commenced, and sooner or later the restriction on nuclear trade will be enforced, and it will not be as promiscuous as it is now. And the next argument was that conventional asymmetry and weaponry between India and Pakistan is already widening. And this is the debate which actually Avner captures in his book a lot more vis-a-vis Israel in the 50s and the 60s. And then finally, the nuclear program will not only necessitate expansion of weapons and other to do the strategic imbalances, but actually create the nuclear science infrastructure and human capital that will really have great amount of boost to the high technology in the future and development and other areas as well. So this was the lobby that was pushing at the time. But then there was an interesting question, because usually the conventional thing is that military and scientific people are the ones who drive nuclear weapons. They are the ones who have a peculiar agenda to do that. In the Pakistani case, it was the other way around. The country was led by a military leader by the name of Ayub Khan. Ayub Khan's argument was that Pakistan's alliance with the United States is weakened due to aggressive security policies that Pakistan conducted in Kashmir, and that was on the advice of the Foreign Office, and we screwed it up. We need to undo this, and we cannot afford to really mess it up again. You see, at that time, when I'm talking about, when this cautionist camp is arguing, Pakistan was boasting about 6 to 8% economic growth from it, given the kind of country that it was born, almost dead. It was almost lying on a deathbed. When suddenly the US alliance in the 50s, just gave it a new life. And within a decade, the country was boasting of growth of 6 to 8%. So you have Atoms for Peace, The scientists are happy, they're getting technology, they're getting training, they're getting all sorts of people are going all over the world. 50 scientists per year were being sent to the top universities all over the world in the late 50s and the mid 60s. Atomic Energy Commission was getting all sorts of advantages to them. They were not interested in doing any hanky-panky to go the nuclear way because that would have stopped. The Pakistani military was probably getting the best of the equipment anywhere they could have in the world. It was really boasting to be a modernized country. The economy of the country was running that South Korea, Malaysia, and other Asian tigers of today would come and see as a model. Samuel Huntington would say, this is the country, look at the model, how soldiers can really run the country and bring back post-colonial country from misery and suddenly start running. Everybody is happy. The military is happy, the bureaucracy is happy, the finance ministry. They're getting the best from the Bretton Woods systems. Why the hell would you want to go into the nuclear business? There is very strong reasons for countries who are so deeply socialized into the international system to really think of going nuclear. And this really makes that the more you're not isolated, the more you have incentive not to go nuclear. So I eventually pushed 3 themes in this book. One is called national humiliation, the other is called international isolationism, and the third is called national identity, which will really run through the whole story. These 3 themes are important, and again, it comes from other states and societies that if states and societies have suffered humiliation of sorts, they will cling to these nuclear weapons. As the Soviet case was the same, the humiliation with the hand of Nazis and later with the Americans. The Chinese case, as John Lewis writes, humiliation, the Japanese first, and then the way Kume and Matsu Island, Taiwan Straits in the mid-50s, and then the Soviets' abandonment in the late 50s, that was where they went into this self-reliance. Now, Pakistani story is so much analogous to this kind of abandonment feeling. And then, this phrase comes again in 2 books, at least, lesser in India's case, but also coming in there. Abner writes about something called never again phenomenon. John Lewis writes never again. And this never again starts coming in, which means that, if you suffer Holocaust, you will say, never again I'm going to suffer Holocaust, the Israeli motive. The Chinese say, never again, this humiliation of the mid-50s. Then the Chinese humiliate the Indians in 62. The Indian says, never again you're going to get the humiliation. Then the Indians humiliate Pakistan in 1971. They say, never again I'm going to get humiliated. You can see the pathway of humiliation. But then there was a sense of isolationism at times, that states were not being listened to. It took a long time for the world to know that Holocaust is something which is a very important element at the root of Israeli insecurity and thinking. It took a long time for India to be told to the world that China could constitute a real threat to India or something. It took a long time. And that isolation period is the one that actually states start, thinking in terms of getting the ultimate weapon. Conversely, that if you are not isolated in the system, you don't have incentives, and many states don't go there. So I'm trying to make a case here of that sort, And then third is the national identity, which is actually not the case in identity, but in Pakistan's case, this became a big issue. Frankly, the state of Pakistan continues to struggle with what is its national identity even today. It really came into existence in a shape that it did not know whether it's going to be a theological state or a state separating out of India for cultural reasons or historical reasons. The founder of the country who really created the country had a different vision. But immediately the theological forces within the country tried to convert that, and that struggle of the state continues today. But then when you start going nuclear and decide to go nuclear, there was no consensus in the country. But this humiliation and other things brought so much of consensus in the country that it became, that is the only one thing on everybody agrees. So you become this national identity problem that, okay, I'm the first Islamic country to do that. And Bhutto started using the terminology that if Hindu civilization can have a bomb, communists can have a bomb, Christians can have a bomb, Jews can have a bomb, why not we the bomb? These are his words, not my words. Exactly, from his death cell he wrote that. So everybody latched on, they said, wow, that's an Islamic bomb. Now, that's what the Islamic bomb theory comes. Actually, he said it rhetorically, and therefore, this is how question of national identity. It's a little more than that. Countries who acquire, they have this premonition of the past, something, and this is more looking into the futuristic that, are we the descendants of the great Mughal Empire or whatever? Are we the great descendants of the Hindu civilization, Indian civilization as it were, the Ming civilization? The Iranians will have this premonition of the Persian glory of the past. It gets associated with their status and prestige, not just simple. When India conducts a bomb and a book is written by Indian intellectual thinker, just one thing, the first thing he writes in the book is, this is not about security, this is about currency of power, unquote. So there is this theme of national identity that becomes. So I jokingly say in Pakistani, nothing they agree on Pakistan, nothing in constitution, nothing on, they don't even say prayers on the same method, they don't even say prayers on the same day. Like they have dispute even on which day the Pakistani equivalent Eid is fall. They celebrate on 3 different days. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, nobody disagrees. And that's a very important factor, that this very intense roller coaster of Pakistani political turbulence, which everybody probably intuitively knows, the bomb program remains unaffected because there is an overwhelming consensus within the state on this issue. So basically, this is where the book actually goes. But I brought something that nuclear cautionists were actually saying on these lines, and they were reluctant when the push was going on. But what did happen was that as a result of 71 war, when there was this humiliating defeat of people who thought themselves very, very proud country, 90,000 soldiers, throwing down their arms in Dhaka, that really converted that thinking. And within 1 month of his taking over power, the bomb lobby comes to power as a result of the military defeat. And then the first thing they do is immediately call the scientists and say, we mean business. They were going nowhere because technological challenges were so high, and I put in the book as to how much technological challenges were there. It's not a joke to do the nuclear thing. They want to do it the way Libya did it, or some other countries were trying to do that. Oh, by the way, on those themes that I talk about, I'd like you to think even further about those 3 themes about humiliation, isolationism, and all. I do observe empirically that all the countries that aspired to go nuclear were all pariah states, all pushed into the wall, all isolated ones. And that's why they attempted to do that. Take the case of North Korea, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Iran. You will see that each one of them were attempting weapon of mass destruction. So I'm just making an empirical case here. But it was interesting when Ayub Khan's diary comes across, the military leader's diary comes across, he writes something which I thought I'll share in the book. He wrote in January 2868, this is the year, he says, I really hope the non-proliferation treaty would come soon. But, there is a beginning of a ruinous nuclear armament race in sight between America and Russia. What a terrible waste of this expenditure. Even a portion of it spent to the needy world would change the history of mankind. Wasteful, purposeless. Nuclear power has put a terrible power of destruction in the hands of mankind. Its military use might well cause utter ruination of human civilization. These weapons are today in the hands of 2 countries. Efforts which I do not think will succeed are being made to prevent their spread. And he goes on and says that, on and on. Now, this kind of a thing is hardly written by military leaders. It's very amazing that it comes from a military leader who has run the country for 10 years. And it was pretty clear as to why Pakistan was so reluctant to go nuclear. If personalities matter, that's what I'm indicating. It does matter as to what did he think about it. He was never convinced that this is going to be the case. And of course, what he said was that effort being made to prevent their spread is not going to succeed, is something very much strikingly similar to what President Eisenhower was saying in his famous speech in the United Nations in December '53. That this is inevitable. That was the Atoms for Peace, the genesis of that. But anyway, when you move fast forward, the next portion of the book is talking about how geopolitically important country can leverage their importance and force the non-proliferation agenda to be pushed into the back burner. So if you are not a geopolitically important country, you do not have the leverage to push them, and they could use that at various times of their history to put the nuclear sanctions back and get out of this. Luck also matters. Was Mr. Brezhnev not that drunk with vodka and not invaded Afghanistan? We might have a counterfactual history here. But a lot of things changed because of those situations. Suddenly, nuclear issue goes into the back burner, and a country under sanctions. In the late 1970s, the country was under sanctions because of two reasons. President Carter slapped sanction on the country for its nuclear activities under the Symington Law. And then there was a military coup by Ziaul Haq. So you had two layers of sanctions, one after the other. And the country's economic or the foreign reserves had fallen down to a few hundred billions. The country was starving. You eat grass. But that's not the whole story. The person who did that nationalized the whole thing during his tenure, that is Zulfikar Ali Bhutto prior to that. And he, a running country with 6 to 8% growth, suddenly became a country with a lot of crises within the state. Not only that, he came with an idea that he would be leading an Islamic socialist movement out in the country. Well, in the end, the socialist movement simply died away. He ended up only appeasing the Islamist forces. The result was that those Islamic forces threw him out and hanged him. And that was the end of liberal Pakistan. This is the genesis of Pakistan nuclear program while this was happening. Now, unless you put all this story into the beginning of the nuclear program, it's like in our Indian subcontinent we say, you're cooking a meat without any spice in it. This is what adds the spice and actually the real flavor about the decision making apparatus as to what was going on. They were eating grass by 79. And there were some ideological pulls and pushes that had begun to happen from 79 to the early 80s. And it's very important for people to know where nuclear decisions were embedded around this time. You all know it intuitively, but when you put it together, it's important to know. 79 is the year when Bhutto is hanged, and 79 is the year when neighboring Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini overthrows the government. Most of you have seen this movie Argo, so you know what's going on in Iran at this time. And the same year, Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now you think about where Pakistan is located, and you think about what's going on in the Middle East, that's neighboring. That's part of neighbor of Pakistan, by the way. Now, Ziaul Haq is saying that, you look around, there is no, Soviets are in Afghanistan, it's all red at the time. And this is the only country that is kind of a bastion, like an island, where the United States can actually do something. So now you are dealing with a new ideological force that is actually, it's called the Shia theological state emerging in Iran. And now you're using this Sunni radical movement and fighting the Soviets on the one hand in Afghanistan, and pummeling Iran from the other side, but supporting Saddam Hussein on the other hand. So what you're doing is you're imploding Afghanistan and Iran into the process. This is the security policy in which the nuclear Pakistan centrifuges are now spinning to some amount of 90% enriched uranium. It doesn't happen just in isolation. So the entire system of customs and immigration, everything had gone haywire by this time, because of this whole asymmetric policy to deal with two twin threats at this time. A theological Shia threat from Iran and communist threat of invasion of Afghanistan, and countries playing the lead role in this whole process. Everybody loved Pakistan. And so everybody is importing not just weapons from Egypt, from Israel, from Charlie Wilson's war. Watch that movie, how things were coming on there. Chinese weapon system is going on. Everybody wanted to trap that bear in Afghanistan. So we are having imported Bin Ladens and Zawaris, and everybody's there. There is no custom, there is no FIR, everything is gone in Pakistan. You know what? There's a state interest also when all this is going on. One ship is coming off Bin Ladens, the other ship is coming off all weapons to go and fight the jihad. The third one is nuclear weapons components. Who's looking after that? And that's how a permissive environment was created where all weaponry systems would be created, and that's where the network and all this was going on in the 80s and all. I can go on telling stories, and I'll stop here because the next phase of the story actually comes in the 1990s when Cold War is ended. But in the post-Cold War, the new environment in the 1990s, the Pakistani quest was not about delivery about the weapon, but it was more about delivery systems. And that's where the MTCR and other regimes actually start playing a role. And in the 1990s, so I used the term called Tom and Jerry in this book. And this whole book goes about how Jerry escapes and how Tom keeps on bouncing, and it keeps on escaping into the hole throughout the history, Also some analogy about Indiana Jones movies that, every time the proliferation shutter comes down, it's just a little late, they slipped out, And the same was happening in the 70s and the 80s with nuclear weapons. Now this was happening with delivery systems, the ballistic missiles and solid fuel missiles, and continued to go until they conducted their test in '98. And the last part of the book actually really talks about, I can really discuss more in the discussion session. That's what I wrote in the article on challenges to stability. Now here is a new nuclear armed country facing all sorts of crises, internal, regional and all. And then suddenly now it has to decide what to do next. Now conducted the test. They didn't choose the timing in May '98 to conduct the test. They were sitting quietly doing that. India conducted the test and now they had to respond. So it is a complete, the timing for Pakistan coming out from the closet was not chosen by Islamabad, it was Delhi's timing. And now they were not prepared to do what. And this is probably the most poignant eating grass moment comes in Pakistan history was the time when they conducted their test. Again, you get the same history repeat, sanction. This time a very severe international sanction that under UN resolution 1172 coming. But more importantly, the Pakistanis are, that's an amazing country. It shoots itself in the foot when everybody else is also shooting on the head. But it shoots itself in the foot. Lo and behold, the country decides to freeze the dollar account of every individual in the country, and everybody started taking their money out from the country, and there's a capital outflow of the country. 180 million people have got 500 million foreign reserve because the money is running out of the country. And now you're eating grass again. People were, jubilant all night when the tests were conducted. That lasted for only a couple of days when they realized that there's nothing in the bank left. The next morning they said, hey, man, what the hell have you done? So the popularity of the leader who decided went like that, and then it started tumbling right down. It was a matter of 1 year, military coup. There's a lot more that happened in the process. I will not go into the details. Look at the combination of this factor. In '99, when the military coup happened, you are again on 2 layers of sanction. Nuclear sanction, as well as, now once again, as I say, luck. Lo and behold, Mr. Bin Laden decides to attack American embassy in Kenya and other places. Nobody had heard of Bin Laden at that time in Pakistan and other places. Suddenly, while the test is going on, the context of nuclear goes behind, and it is Osama bin Laden's attack in Kenya and other places become important. And now US is saying, what do we do? Do we remove sanctions or do what? That's the point. Geopolitical leverage came again. And 3 years later, you know what happened in 9/11, that changed the whole thing. No sanction, nothing. And that helped operationalize the deterrent for the next 10 years. But more importantly, that I mentioned that as much as they were having the challenges of spinning a centrifuge, actually you can talk more about that. Challenge to really get into a reprocessing plant and not France abandoning. France, Canada, Germany abandoned the same way, Soviet abandoned Chinese, and that converted into resolve. Exactly the same way of self-reliance happened in Pakistan, but this time they were wanting to convert this into operational deterrent forces. They didn't have any experience what to do. And it's a remarkable story that in 10 years' time, they would convert this by studying Cold War models, by studying examination, and develop 3 to 4 distinctly develop strategic forces, develop command control communication systems to harness those forces, develop a strong diplomatic system to engage into international diplomacy, no experience. And fourthly, then develop a nuclear security culture as a result of the instability post 9/11 that happened and many other events and experience that happened. So today when they come up, you can find that they have a very robust command system, a very robust system that is functioning on nuclear security. Because they go and Seoul and other places and say, you want to learn a nuclear security culture, send somebody to Islamabad, we'll teach them how to organize and how to manage nuclear weapons now. So this is the story that goes into the later part. But end of the day, it is almost 15 years after getting all the nuclear weapons. End of the day, Bhutto might have said this sentence rather rhetorically, but it has turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy as we speak today. And that's where my book ends. So.